Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a chain of islands you've probably seen on a map, but maybe never pictured in your mind this way. Imagine stepping barefoot onto a beach where the sand squeaks like powdered sugar. The humidity immediately makes your hair look like it joined a rock band, and the air smells of salt, smoke from cooking fires, and something vaguely fishy that, let's be real, probably won't survive if you have a picky stomach. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in right now, go ahead and drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where and when you're listening from. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive in the Philippines long before it's called the Philippines. Long before flags are stitched. Long before any anthem is sung. Right now, you're just one traveler drifting into a tropical archipelago where more than 7,000 islands scatter across warm seas. Each island feels like its own little kingdom. Some with thick jungles full of chattering birds. Some with beaches where traders pull up boats heavy with porcelain jars, spices, and occasionally a stowaway rat who probably thinks he's living his best life. The people you meet here are not waiting for colonizers to tell them how to live. They already have villages called barangays, each led by a dotu, kind of chief who's equal parts warrior, diplomat, and occasional judge when someone steals too many coconuts. Social classes are well defined: the nobles, the freemen, and the dependent folks who owe labor. And if you think life was just endless coconut sipping, there were rivalries, alliances, and rituals that involved chanting, betel nut chewing, and maybe a few too many sharp weapons lying around. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 10th century, these islands had established trade with China, India, and the Islamic sultanates of nearby regions. Chinese porcelain and silk show up in digs all over Luzon and Visayas, proof that this wasn't some sleepy, isolated place. It was connected, vibrant, and thriving. And then there's the quirky tidbit archaeologists once uncovered. What's now called the Laguna copperplate inscription? A 900 CE document that basically shows someone paying off a debt. Imagine leaving behind a stone receipt that historians fawn over 1,000 years later. You forget to keep your Walmart receipt for a month, and suddenly you're a time traveler out of luck. The people here wear colorful woven fabrics, often dyed with natural pigments, and decorate themselves with gold jewelry so abundant that some Spanish accounts later exaggerated. Filipinos, as practically dripping with it. And they're not wrong minds, in Luzon and Mindan really did produce gold that traders wanted. Gold was used in trade, rituals, and sometimes even as tooth ornaments. Yep, flashy grills existed centuries before hip-hop made them cool. You notice the spiritual world pulses strongly here. Animism is the core. Everything has a spirit, from the trees to the rivers to that rock you stub your toe on. Shamans, often called Babylon, lead rituals, heal with herbs, and whisper incantations. Interestingly, many Babylon are women, which made the spiritual role a rare space of female power in societies that were otherwise patriarchal. Historians still argue whether this gender dynamic was more progressive than in neighboring regions, or just one of those quirks that colonial narratives later tried to erase. On the water, boats glide like moving villages. They're called balangay, large enough to carry whole families, supplies, and warriors. These boats are so important that the word itself gives us the term barangay. Imagine your entire neighborhood floating on a giant canoe. It's efficient, but also terrifying. If you're the one stuck bailing water when a storm hits, life isn't just trade and spirit rituals. Warfare is a thing raids rival clans, and even sea-raiding expeditions called mangaya. Warriors decorate themselves with tattoos that mark victories, each inked line like a permanent brag sheet. The more tattoos you have, the tougher your reputation. It's basically Instagram likes, except it hurts and lasts forever. But it's not all fighting. Music thrums from bamboo instruments. Gongs echo in gatherings. And oral epics are sung that stretch for hours, sometimes days, without anyone yawning. Okay, maybe they did yawn, but the point is, Stories and rhythm flow like water through these communities, connecting generations as you move from island to island. You sense the variety. Muslim sultanates in the south, especially in Sulu and Mindanao, where trade with Arabia and Borneo has brought Islam centuries before Spain's arrival. Hindu-Buddhist influences flicker in art and epics in the Central Islands. And up north, tribes with their own cosmologies and customs still thrive. The archipelago is a patchwork quilt stitched by ocean currents, trade winds, human stubbornness. The sun dips lower, painting everything in orange and violet. Fires spark in villages, drums echo, and the scent of roasting fish lingers in the air. You sit, chewing betel nut offered by a stranger, your teeth slowly turning red, and you realize you've slipped into a world that already pulses with culture, power, and history, long before anyone plants a European flag here. You wander farther inland, leaving the shoreline where canoes bob like toys in a giant bath, and stepping into villages alive with chatter, chickens, and smoke from clay hearths. The world before Spain's galleons feels both familiar and alien. Families huddled around meals of rice and fish, kids daring each other to climb coconut trees, elders sitting cross-legged and chewing betel nuts like they're in some eternal spitting competition. And right away you realize there's order here, not chaos. Every barangay has a dotu, and he's not just the strong man with the biggest bolo knife. He's a leader who collects tribute, judges disputes, and leads men to war when necessary. You can almost hear him mutter, "Don't make me raise taxes, I just might." The hierarchy runs deeper than the dotu's authority. Nobles sit at the top, flaunting their status with tattoos and gold ornaments, while freemen amaw work fields or fight as warriors. Below them, the dependent and enslaved classes carry burdens, often because of debts or war capture. This isn't the kind of egalitarian island paradise travel brochures promise. Nope, it's closer to an ancient soap opera, full of rivalry, loyalty, and sometimes betrayal, just minus the slow emotion camera zooms. Now here's a mainstream historical fact. The barangay system was the core political structure across the islands. Each one was autonomous, and while some barangays formed alliances, there wasn't a unified Philippines in any sense before colonization. That patchwork would later make both conquest and resistance incredibly complicated. And for a quirky tidbit, pig sacrifices were part of rituals to appease spirits or seal agreements. Imagine signing a business contract today and then casually slaughtering a pig beside your lawyer. Congratulations. You're promoted. Now grab a knife. The rituals weren't just symbolic, they were binding. Oaths made with animal blood were seen as unbreakable, and breaking them could supposedly invite spiritual doom. Religious life fills your senses as the Babylon. Spiritual medium chants to unseen forces. Smoke curls into the sky, herbs are burned, and offerings of rice, chicken, or jewelry are left by rivers or buried under posts of newly built homes. The belief is clear. Everything around you has a spirit, and you'd better keep them happy, because an offended spirit might give you a fever or make your rice harvest fail. Historians still argue whether these rituals were more about faith or social control. But standing there in the firelight, you feel the goosebumps creep up your arms regardless. Trade hums constantly. On one island, you find Chinese porcelain stacked like treasure in huts, evidence of long-standing barter networks. On another, you watch Indian beads pass from hand to hand, woven into local jewelry. Traders arrive with jars of oil, bolts of silk, and spices that would later spark wars across Europe. And you? You're lucky if you can snag a handful of dried fish without accidentally paying double in some complicated barter exchange where no one explains the rules. Food itself feels abundant but different. People eat rice, tubers, bananas, and seafood in dizzying variety. Palm wine tuba is a favorite drink, tapped from coconut trees and shared in gatherings. One sip, and you understand why folks sing epics for hours. Another sip, and you realize you're not entirely sure what planet you're on. Let's just say karaoke culture didn't start in the 1980s. It's been buzzing here for centuries, just minus the off-key microphones. Clothing varies from island to island. loincloths, and woven skirts. Cloaks dyed in vibrant reds and blues, and ornaments of gold and shells. Warriors sometimes wear armor made from thickened cloth or animal hide. Not quite as intimidating as medieval knights, but still effective if you're dodging arrows. And those tattoos? Each line tells a story of battles fought, journeys made, or even spiritual trials overcome. You try not to stare too long at a man whose chest is covered in ink that makes him look like a walking comic strip of violence. At night, epics and stories ring out. One elder recites the Hudhud chants of the Ifugao, long tales about heroes, ancestors, and rice gods. These stories aren't just entertainment. They're libraries of cultural memory. People memorize them across generations, word for word, which makes your inability to remember where you parked last Tuesday feel embarrassing. Conflict. Of course, pulses under the surface. Raiding isn't just common, it's a way of life. Men prepare for Mangaya expeditions, sea raids that bring captives, loot, and honor. Boats are carved sleek and fast, ready to slip along coastlines under cover of night. You watch warriors paint themselves, their chants rolling into the dark. And you wonder what it must feel like to live in a world where honor can depend on how many raids you've survived. But life isn't all war and rituals. Markets buzz with chatter. Farmers till rice terraces in the north, yes, those famous Banu terraces that look like green staircases carved into mountainsides. They're not just scenic wonders. They're feats of engineering, showing how deeply communities understood their land. The terraces glisten with water, layer upon layer, reflecting the sky. You stand at their base, neck craned, feeling small and oddly proud for people you haven't even met. Even justice has its quirks. Trials might involve ordeals like plunging a hand into boiling water or chewing raw rice and spitting it out to see if you're guilty. Spoiler alert. If you're unlucky, the spirits convict you whether or not you actually did the crime. Historians still argue whether these ordeals were truly believed or simply convenient ways to scare people straight. Either way, you probably wouldn't risk shoplifting coconuts here. And through it all, the rhythm of life beats steadily. The gongs echo, children laugh, warriors boast, shamans chant, and the ocean whispers at the edge of every island. You sense an order so rooted in custom that it feels immovably at just over the horizon. Sails are already rising, and with them, the storms of change you'll soon face. You step onto a shoreline, shimmering under the tropical sun. But the horizon tonight feels different. Out there, on the edge of vision, strange sails swell like white wings. They don't look like the Balangay boats you've seen. These are taller, heavier, and moving with a confidence that says, "We've come a long way, and we're not just here for coconuts." You squint. And there it is, the arrival of Europeans. The year is 1521, and Ferdinand Magellan has just crossed the Pacific with ships that look more like floating fortresses than anything these islands have seen. You imagine the villagers watching from the beach, shading their eyes, muttering, well, those are either gods or really lost fishermen. You can almost taste the confusion in the air. The nervous mix of curiosity and suspicion. Magellan and his men step ashore with their heavy boots, metal armor clinking and banners snapping in the wind. The locals are struck by these pale strangers with facial hair so thick, it looks like they accidentally glued moss to their faces. Communication is shaky, but trade, gestures, and cautious gifts bridge the gap. And soon enough, the missionaries begin their work. Crosses rise, prayers are said, and you feel the tension of two worlds colliding animist. Rituals and Catholic ceremonies staring each other down like awkward dinner. Guests who don't know who should say grace. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Magellan didn't actually survive his Philippine adventure. He was killed at the Battle of Mactan by the forces of Lapalapu, a local chieftain who became legendary for resisting foreign intrusion. That clash, fought on the shorelines of Cebu, has been retold so often it's practically mythic. The first major moment when islanders said, "No thanks, conquistadors." And now for the quirky tidbit, some accounts mention that during negotiations with local leaders, Europeans gifted mirrors and glass trinkets. Imagine seeing your reflection clearly for the first time in your life. It must have been like magic, or terrifying. depending on whether you had rice stuck in your teeth. The first Catholic Mass in the archipelago is held in Limasawa. You stand there, smelling the salty air as friars chant Latin hymns nobody understands. For locals, it's like watching a play in a foreign language, except the actors are dead serious about it. Historians still argue whether this Mass marked the official start of Christianity in the islands, or was just one isolated event. But in the narrative of empire, it's treated like the planting of a seed. But not all encounters are peaceful. The Battle of Mactan erupts when Magellan decides to flex his military muscle against Lapu-Lapu. You walk with the Spaniards across the shallows at dawn, armor clunky and water up to your waist, while islanders light on their feet. Shower the invaders with arrows, spears, and rocks. Magellan falls, pierced and overwhelmed. His men retreat in shock, dragging their ships back out to sea. On the sand, the locals cheer not just a victory, but proof that these armored strangers can bleed. The irony: Magellan's death didn't end Spanish ambition. Instead, it became a dramatic prelude. Within a few decades, more expeditions returned, this time with firmer plans and better resources. But for the moment, you breathe in relief with the villagers. Enjoying the triumph of Lapu-Lapu, warrior chief who never asked to be a national hero but ended up as one anyway. Daily life goes on, even as whispers spread of these newcomers. In Visayan villages, storytellers already weave tales of men in shining shells who fall to mortal spears. Traders gossip about these pale-skinned strangers with fire sticks that roar louder than thunder. Some think they are gods. Others think they're just greedy men with terrible fashion sense. You lean in, listening, realizing that these conflicting views foreshadow centuries of confusion, resistance, and adaptation. And then there's the food exchange. The Spaniards bring with them things like bread, olives, and wine, though honestly, none of it impresses the locals who already enjoy rice, fish, and fruits. But the Spaniards do notice how delicious coconuts are, sipping the water like they just discovered nature's sports drink. You smirk welcome to the tropics, gentlemen. We've had Gatorade for centuries at night. As you sit around a fire with locals retelling the Battle of Mactan, you catch sight of the stars. The same stars that guided Magellan across oceans now shine above warriors celebrating victory. The constellations feel like silent witnesses, indifferent to who plants flags or wins skirmishes. You can almost hear them whisper, "This isn't over. Bigger storms are coming." So you drift into uneasy sleep on the sand, belly full of roasted fish, ears buzzing with laughter and triumph. But the image of those tall sails lingers in your mind. They left once, but deep down you know they'll be back. And when they return, it won't be just with mirrors and prayers. It'll be with the weight of empire, and the islands you've just come to know will never be the same. The sails return just as you feared. Only this time they're more than just a handful of ships testing the waters. You watch the horizon fill with crosses fluttering on banners, cannons poking out like sneering mouths, and men marching ashore with the quiet arrogance of those convinced the world belongs to them. Spain has decided that these islands are too rich, too strategic, too tempting to leave alone. And so, the conquest begins in earnest. It's the mid-1500s. Miguel López de Legazpi arrives to establish something far more permanent than Magellan's fleeting adventure. He sets up shop in Cebu first, before casting his eyes on Manila. Why Manila? Because it's already a thriving trade hub where Chinese junks unload silk and porcelain. Arab and Malay traders barter spices. And local rulers, like Raja Suleiman, hold court with the kind of charisma you'd expect from someone who knows his city is valuable. You trail behind Legazpi's men as they negotiate, clash, and eventually plant their flag. Manila falls in 1571, and from then on, it becomes the glittering capital of Spain's far Eastern Empire. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Manila was formally established as a Spanish city in 1571, becoming not just a local hub, but the gateway between Asia and the Americas through the famous Manila-Acapulco galleon trade. It was like plugging the Philippines straight into the veins of global commerce. And now for the quirky tidbit. Some records suggest that friars introduced European-style bread to locals. But without proper ovens, people improvised by baking over coals. The result? pan de sal, a bread that's still a breakfast staple today. Imagine empire reshaping diets so deeply that for centuries later, you're still dunking that colonial bread into coffee every morning. But back to those friars, you can't miss them. They march in, robes swishing, crucifixes raised, eyes alight with missionary zeal. They're not just spreading religion. They're reorganizing entire communities. The policy of reduction gathers scattered barangays into centralized towns with the church at the center. Suddenly, life revolves around the plaza, the bells, and the friar's booming voice. You can almost hear the groans of villagers forced to move away from ancestral lands just so Father so-and-so can keep a closer eye on them. Historians still argue whether the friars were protectors of the people against abusive officials or the biggest abusers themselves. What you see, though, is complicated. Friars teaching reading, introducing crops, and tending to the sick, but also demanding tributes, controlling marriages, and occasionally lashing out at anyone who dared defy their authority. The duality feels sharp, like the friar is half saint, half neighborhood gossip who never minds his own business. Meanwhile, silver galleons begin their transoceanic dance. Picture massive ships groaning under the weight of American silver, Chinese silk, and Filipino labor. Every year, 1 or 2 galleons cross the Pacific from Manila to Acapulco, creating a flow of goods so immense that historians later call it the first global economy. You sneak aboard one ship, inhaling the musty scent of spices mingled with sweat, wood tar, and dead rats. It's glamorous in theory, miserable in reality, like trying to live inside a Costco warehouse that hasn't been cleaned in years. Back in the villages, people adjust or try to. Christianity spreads, churches rise, and fiestas erupt with new layers of ritual. But resistance simmers. Some Dadas accept Spanish authority in exchange for titles and privileges. Others rebel, their uprisings crushed with fire and steel. You can feel the tension between survival and pride, between adaptation and resistance, humming beneath every drumbeat in the plazas. And there are the Chinese. Yes, the Parian district of Manila swells with Chinese traders who supply the colony with goods, services, and food. They're indispensable, yet constantly distrusted by the Spanish authorities. You hear whispers of pogroms, mass killings that erupt whenever paranoia spikes. It's a reminder that colonial cities, no matter how glittering, rest on fragile foundations of fear and prejudice. In the streets of Manila, life feels dizzying. Horses clatter over cobblestones, friars stride with purpose, Chinese merchants haggle loudly, and Tagalog workers haul goods under the scorching sun. The smell of fish sauce, burning candles, and horse manure mix into one unforgettable perfume. You want to gag, but hey, history doesn't always smell good. As night falls, you stand by the walls of Intramuros, the stone fortress city Spain has built, complete with moats and cannons. Inside, Spaniards sip chocolate drinks imported from Mexico, while outside, locals strain under taxes and forced labor. That contrast is sharp, brutal, and impossible to ignore. You gaze up at the stars again. They look the same as they did in the days of Lapu-Lapu, but the ground beneath your feet has shifted. Manila is no longer just a port. It's the jewel of Spain's Asian empire. And the people of these islands? They're caught in a whirlwind of change, new gods, new rulers, new taxes, and new possibilities. You sense both promise and peril ahead. And you're not wrong, because the centuries to come will test every ounce of resilience these islands can muster. You wake to the sound of bells, loud, insistent, impossible to ignore. The friars have made sure of that. Their towers rise like stone fingers above every town, calling people to mass, to confession, to festivals, and sometimes just to remind everyone who's really in charge. You shuffle toward the plaza, half curious, half annoyed at the relentless clang. And there it is. A church packed with villagers kneeling before statues that sparkle in candlelight. The smell of incense hangs thick, mixing with sweat. You realize faith here isn't just a private matter, it's a public performance. Christianity has spread fast. It's faster than you expect. Entire barangays have been baptized. often under pressure. Friars preach in Tagalog, Visayan, or whatever dialect is needed, reshaping ancient chants into Catholic prayers. You catch sight of a Babylon, the old shaman, standing in the crowd with downcast eyes. Her role has shrunk overnight. Once she mediated between spirits and humans, now she's pushed to the edges, called a witch or a heretic. It's not a graceful retirement, it's cultural erasure. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 17th century, the Philippines had become the most thoroughly Christianized colony in Asia. Catholicism wasn't just religion. It was the glue Spain used to bind its empire here. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some friars taught locals to sing Latin hymns. Communities memorized them phonetically without understanding a single word. Imagine belting out Ave Maria with perfect rhythm, but no clue you're praising the Virgin Mary. You're basically doing karaoke in a dead language. But faith doesn't land the same everywhere. In the northern highlands, the Igorot tribes resist conversion, clinging to their rituals in mountain strongholds. In Mindanao and Sulu, Muslim sultanates fight tooth and nail, pushing back against both crosses and cannons. You can almost hear their defiance in the clang of Campelin's swords. In the stern sermons of imams reminding everyone that these invaders are just another test. Historians still argue whether Islam might have spread further north had Spain never arrived, but standing here, you sense the what-ifs piling high like storm clouds. Resistance simmers in other forms too. Villagers rise against oppressive tribute, rebellions breaking out like brush fires. Each one tells you something about colonial rulets never fully secure. The 1600s see uprisings led by charismatic figures, Temblet and Bahal, a Balan who insists the old gods can drive out the Spaniards. Sumaroy and Samar, whose revolt sparks after forced labor, becomes unbearable. You watch these movements flare with passion, only to be crushed by superior Spanish firepower and treachery. Still, every rebellion leaves scars, like tattoos etched into the land's memory. And yet fiestas bloom. Yes, those noisy, colorful celebrations we still see today. Villagers dance in parades honoring saints, blending Spanish Catholic ritual with older rhythms and superstitions. You nibble on roasted pig lechon, its skin crackling so perfectly you almost forget you're at a religious festival and not a food fair. Fireworks explode, drums beat, and suddenly Catholicism feels less like a foreign imposition and more like a shared spectacle that everyone, willing or not, has learned to enjoy. Taxes, though, are harder to enjoy. The Poloi Servicio forces men into unpaid labor for public works, roads, churches, ships. You watch them sweating under the sun, hauling timber, carving stone. Their bodies bent under burdens that aren't theirs by choice. Some try to flee into the mountains. Others pay bribes to avoid the draft. Those who can't escape work until exhaustion claims them? You shake your head. Colonial rule has a way of sanctifying exploitation with holy-sounding words in the countryside. Friars run the show. They control land, dictate morality, and often clash with secular Spanish officials. Parish records fill with baptisms, marriages, confessions tools, not just of faith but of surveillance. You overhear villagers whisper about the friar's temper, his demands for chickens or rice, and you realize that the church isn't just spiritual authority. It's landlord, boss, and judge rolled into one. Still, some friars genuinely care. You watch one tending to the sick with herbs, another teaching children to read, another standing up to soldiers who try to overtax villagers. It's messy saints and sinners wearing the same robes. You can't tell if you should admire them or roll your eyes. So you do both. And then there's the image that lingers. A Bobolantern, rebel leading a secret ritual in the forest. Chanting under the moon, refusing to let the old gods die. Her followers clutch amulets, convinced they make them bulletproof. When Spanish muskets shatter that belief, it's tragic, but also defiant. Faith here has become a battlefield, with crosses clashing against anitos and crescent moons. The bells ring again. Mass is over, the plaza buzzing with chatter. Children chase each other, old men argue about taxes, women trade gossip about the friars' new habits. Life goes on, a strange fusion of old and new. You feel it in the air, a people reshaped, but not broken, a culture bent but not erased. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the sermons and statues, resistance smolders, waiting for its moment to burst once more into flame. You drift away from the church bells and the rebel chants into the everyday heartbeat of colonial life. No grand battles tonight, no treaties written with fancy quills, just the grind and gossip of ordinary days. You walk into a small town, the kind that sprang up around a church in a dusty plaza, and you immediately get hit with the smells. Dried fish stacked in baskets, rice cooking in clay pots, and somewhere nearby, someone brewing tuba that smells like coconut juice trying to pass as beer. The houses catch your eye. Bahay Kuba Nipa Hutsrais on stilts, bamboo walls letting air pass through, thatched roofs whispering in the wind. Inside, mats line the floor, families eat with their hands. And you get offered rice and salted fish so politely you can't refuse. It's simple, efficient, and honestly pretty cozy until mosquitoes show up and remind you that paradise has terms and conditions. In richer towns, though, you start seeing stone houses with tiled roofs. Bahay Bodo blending Spanish style with local adaptation. Downstairs, storage for horses or goods. Upstairs, wooden floors where families live. You can practically hear the neighbors complaining about noise from the street. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Spanish colonial system imposed the encomienda, where Spaniards were granted the right to collect tribute from local communities in exchange for protection and Christianization. It often turned into exploitation, with villagers groaning under heavy taxes paid in rice, gold, or labor. Now the quirky tidbit, tooth blackening, called nganga, remained popular. People chewed betel nut until their teeth turned red or black, considering it beautiful. Europeans were horrified, writing in their diaries like, "These people stain their teeth like savages," while locals probably looked back thinking, "At least ours don't rot like yours." Beauty standards, forever misunderstood. Markets are lively. You hear women haggling loudly over fish prices, children darting between stalls, and men boasting about their new carabao as if it were a sports car. The plaza is more than commerce, is the town's gossip hub. News spreads here faster than fire through Nipa. Whose daughter eloped, whose cousin skipped mass, whose rooster lost spectacularly in last week's cockfight. You linger, ears buzzing with chatter, realizing that this plaza is basically Facebook before Facebook minus the memes, but twice the drama. Cockfighting, by the way, is serious business. You watch men crowd around a dusty pit, pesos changing hands, shouts echoing as two roosters clash in a flurry of feathers. To outsiders, it's brutal. To locals, it's pride, tradition, and entertainment rolled into one. You can't help smirking. Vegas fights have nothing on the intensity here, and then there's food. Everyday meals are humble. Rice with fish, vegetables, and maybe pork if you're lucky. But during fiestas, the tables groan with lechin stews and sweet rice cakes. You're offered by binka hot from a clay oven, its banana leaves still steaming. You take a bite, and suddenly you understand why colonial reports often noted that Filipinos loved celebrations. It wasn't just about saints. It was about community, music, and eating until your pants begged for mercy. Education is uneven. Friars teach some children to read and write, mostly boys, mostly in religious contexts. Girls might learn to sew, cook, or recite prayers. Higher education is rare, reserved for a handful of mestizos, or those bound for the priesthood. But oral tradition remains strong. Stories, epics, riddles, and songs carry culture across generations. You sit by a fire as a grandmother tells a tale about enchanted beings, her voice weaving magic stronger than any textbook. Historians still argue whether Spanish colonial rule destroyed native culture or simply transformed it into something hybrid. Looking around, you see both. The Babylon fading into obscurity, while fiesta queens parade in borrowed European gowns. Rice terraces still thriving while towns adopt Spanish-style governance. The word for it is mestiza, not just for people of mixed blood, but for the culture itself, blending and bending under pressure. Evenings in the town bring music. Someone plucks a guitar, yes, a colonial import, while others sing folk songs that sound both Spanish and local. Couples flirt under the moonlight, parents pretend not to notice, and dogs bark like unpaid security guards. You feel a strange warmth, realizing that beneath the weight of tribute and sermons, people carve out joy in the rhythms of their days. Still, shadows linger. Forced labor drags men into building ships for the Galleon trade, women left behind struggling to tend fields. Epidemics sweep through villages with no mercy, killing thousands, leaving plazas eerily quiet. And when you ask locals about taxes, their groans say everything. Life isn't all fiestas and serenades at survival. Under constant demands, as you step away from the noise of the plaza, you glance back at the church's silhouette looming over the town. It's both protector and oppressor, both center of faith and reminder of foreign power. Life here is complicated, sometimes cruel, sometimes beautiful, always resilient. You breathe it in, the mix of smoke, song, and sweat, and realize you're not just watching colonial life, you're living in its contradictions. You drift inland now, away from the busy plazas and church bells, into hills and valleys where whispers of resistance never fully die out. The air grows thicker with the scent of damp earth. Bamboo groves closing in like green cathedrals, and you sense you've stepped into a quieter but more dangerous space. Here, history doesn't march in parades. It mutters in secret gatherings, carried on the breath of rebels and prophets. Rebellions keep popping up like weeds after rain. You might think Spain's heavy hand would crush the spirit out of everyone, but no each generation seems to cough up a new leader with fire in their belly. Sometimes it's about religion, sometimes about taxes, sometimes just plain exhaustion at being bossed around by friars and soldiers who don't even speak the same language. Here's your mainstream historical fact, one of the earliest large-scale uprisings was led by Francisco de Gajoy in Bohol. Starting in 1744, his revolt lasted 85 years. Yes, 85. That's longer than some Netflix shows feel when you're binge-watching. Dagohoy's followers built hidden settlements in the mountains, raiding Spanish forces, refusing to bow. It became the longest rebellion in Philippine history. Now for a quirky tidbit, some rebels believed in anting-anting, mystical amulets said to make the wearer invincible. These charms were often inscribed with Latin phrases no one fully understood. Sometimes upside down, sometimes mashed together like a bad Google Translate. Rebels charged into battle convinced bullets would bounce off them like rubber. Spoiler, bullets did not agree with this plan. But rebellions weren't just about magic. They were about dignity. Tamblet that Babylon from Baja in the 1600s promised the old gods would return if people burned the churches and drove out the friars. Thousands rallied to him before Spanish muskets put an end to his vision. Later, in Pampanga, Kapampangan leaders rebelled when forced labor for shipbuilding broke their backs. The Spanish crown needed galleons. Locals just wanted to plant rice and feed their families. You can feel the bitterness in their voices. It's like smoke rising from damp wood. Historians still argue whether these uprisings were nationalists in spirit or just local outbursts. Were people consciously fighting for a united Filipino identity? Or were they simply tired of tribute and taxes in their own backyard? You lean toward the second explanation. But who knows, sometimes history plants seeds of nationalism. Long before anyone knows they're growing, you move through forests that once sheltered rebel bands. Bamboo sways in the wind, cicadas scream their endless chorus, and you imagine the rustle of leaves hiding men armed with bolos, waiting for a patrol to pass. Spanish soldiers feared these places, jungles where disease, ambushes, and spirits conspired against them. A rebel strike here was fast and brutal, vanishing back into the green before the smoke cleared. Still, rebellion always carried a price. After every failed uprising, villages were burned, leaders executed, families torn apart. You picture gallows in the plaza, the friar offering last rites to men who spat defiance with their final breath. And yet the cycle repeated. Hope, revolt, defeat, repression, like a stubborn drumbeat echoing through centuries. Even among the rebels, there were contradictions. Some were devout Catholics who prayed to saints before charging into battle. Others wanted to erase Christianity and restore old rituals. Some fought for land rights, others just for revenge. It wasn't a clean story, and maybe that's the point. Resistance is messy, just like life itself. And then there are the stories whispered more than written. A leader who claimed angels spoke to him at night, telling him to resist. A woman who dreamed of a glowing cross that promised protection in battle. A farmer who swore his bolo glowed red whenever injustice loomed. You don't know what's myth and what's fact, but in the sleepy rhythm of this narrative, you realize myths often carry truths sharper than swords. The Spanish called these rebels bandits, heretics, pagans, anything to strip them of legitimacy. But to their followers, they were heroes, saints, proof that submission wasn't the only option. You sit by a fire in one of these imagined camps, hearing voices sing songs of defiance. The lyrics are simple, the rhythm steady. And you realize the song is less about victory and more about endurance. Night settles on the mountains. A crescent moon rises, casting silver across the jungle. You sense the rebels' silhouettes moving quietly, blades strapped to their waists, charms tied around their necks. Their eyes burn with something that doesn't fade, something no decree, no friar's sermon, no musket can erase. It's the stubborn insistence that life should be lived on their own terms, even if the cost is everything. The night fades into dawn, and suddenly you're blinking against a light that glints not off church bells or jungle leaves, but off the endless shimmer of the sea. The horizon stretches wide, dotted with sails, and you realize you've stumbled into the heart of a system that tied the Philippines to the world, the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade. Picture this: every year or two, massive ships, floating fortresses of wood and canvas, set out from Manila, loaded with silks from China, spices from the Indies, ivory, porcelain, and anything fancy enough to make European nobles loosen their coin purses. These ships lumbered across the Pacific, sometimes vanishing into storms, sometimes limping into Acapulco months later like hungover sailors. In return, silver from the Americas poured back into Manila, enough to make the colony feel like a treasure chest cracked open on the edge of Asia. Here's your mainstream historical fact: the galleon trade ran from 1565 to 1815, linking Asia, the Americas, and Europe in one giant economic circuit. For 250 years, Manila was the linchpin of global commerce. Not bad for an archipelago that, at the start, Spain didn't even think was worth much beyond being a pit stop and the quirky tidbit. The galleons were so overstuffed with cargo that crews sometimes stashed contraband silks under their shirts or stuffed spices into barrels labeled as something boring, like dried fish. Smugglers thrived, and officials looked the other way as long as they got their cut. It was basically the 17th century version of duty-free shopping, minus the airport security. But you, wandering the docks, see the cost hidden beneath the wealth. Filipino men are drafted into Polo y Servicio, forced labor to cut timber, haul supplies, and build these enormous ships. You run your hand along rough planks of galleon hulls, each one soaked with sweat, sometimes blood. Men die of exhaustion, disease, or drowning in shipyards. Their lives consumed by vessels they'll never sail. Historians still argue whether the trade enriched the colony or merely siphoned its wealth outward. On one hand, Manila became a bustling city, filled with Chinese merchants in the Parian Quarter. Mexican silver glittering in markets, European fashions swishing down cobbled streets. On the other, local industries withered because Spain banned many exports to keep the galleon monopoly intact. Imagine living on islands rich with resources but being told you can't trade freely because someone 10,000 miles away wrote a loya. Not exactly empowering. You stroll through Intramuros, the walled city of Manila, hearing the clatter of hooves on stone streets. Behind massive gates, Spaniards and mestizos live in grand houses with thick stone walls, their balconies draped in embroidered fabrics that smell faintly of the sea. Inside churches, silver chalices gleam, proof of the trans-Pacific flow of wealth. Meanwhile, outside those walls, ordinary Filipinos struggle in wooden huts, their wealth measured in rice harvests, and carabao strength, the contrast hits you like the sharp sting of salt air. Yet, even in the inequality, cultural exchange thrived. From Mexico came maize, cacao, and chili peppers, foods that reshaped Filipino cuisine forever. You sip a cup of chocolate, thick hot chocolate whisked with a wooden batidor, and you grin. Sweet, slightly bitter. Warm, it tastes like history sneaking into your bloodstream. The galleon trade also brought new ideas. Sailors carried not just goods, but stories, songs, gossip. Filipino crew members Indios pressed into service sometimes jumped ship in Mexico, leaving descendants who blurred lines between continents. Somewhere in Acapulco, a farmer with brown skin and almond eyes might trace his bloodline back to these islands. Proof that history flows in surprising directions. But danger lurked with every voyage. Pirates prowled the Pacific, storms shredded sails, and sometimes entire galleons sank with treasure worth kingdoms. You close your eyes and hear the groaning of timbers in a storm, men shouting prayers. Silver bars sliding across decks before vanishing into the hungry sea. Even now, treasure hunters dream of finding those wrecks, as if history itself left breadcrumbs made of silver. You can't help smirking when you think about how Manila's economy basically revolved around waiting for one or two giant ships a year. If the galleon arrived safely, parties exploded. If not, well, famine, bankruptcies, and a lot of people sighing into their empty purses. Imagine a whole country tied to the reliability of maritime hubs, and you'll get the picture. Walking away from the docks, you notice something else. Resentment brewing beneath the bustle. The trade enriched a small elite, while the majority toiled under tribute and forced labor. That imbalance didn't vanish, it fermented, like tuba left too long in the jar, sour and head-spinning. Someday, those grievances would matter more than silk and silver. But for now, Manila hums with the music of coins clinking, bells ringing, and gulls circling overhead. The sea keeps glimmering, as if mocking the idea that wealth can ever be chained. You watch another galleon sail into the horizon, its sails fat with wind. And you wonder if the men rowing logs in the shipyards dream of freedom each time they glance at that endless blue. The clamor of the docks fades, and in its place, you hear the quiet hum of villages. The rustle of sugarcane leaves, and the distant moo of carabaos pulling plows. You've stepped into the countryside, where the real backbone of the colony lies not in Intramuros stone walls, or the glint of silver coins, but in the endless grind of agricultural life. Rice fields stretch out like green mirrors, reflecting the sky. Men and women move barefoot through the mud, planting seedlings in rows so neat they look almost rehearsed. The sun beats down, sweat runs into eyes, but still the rhythm holds steady. This is survival. Rice for the table, rice for tribute. Rice for selling in markets that never pay enough. Here's your mainstream historical fact. During Spanish rule, vast estates called haciendas grew, controlled either by friars or by Spanish and mestizo landlords. These estates often forced tenant farmers into debt and dependence, creating patterns of inequality that still ripple through Philippine society today. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some villagers trained carabaos to respond to singing. Farmers would belt out tunes while plowing, and the carabao, bless its massive heart, would move faster when the melody rose. Imagine karaoke as a form of agricultural management. It's both hilarious and weirdly genius. Life in the countryside revolves around cycles: planting, harvesting, festivals, storms. Houses cluster near rivers, bamboo groves, or churches. Chickens cluck underfoot, pigs grunt in pens, and kids chase each other with sticks, pretending they're swords. The smell of wood smoke drifts from kitchens, where fish sizzles on clay stoves and rice cooks in iron pots that have been passed down like heirlooms. But beneath this simple rhythm, pressures build. Tribute collectors arrive with stern faces demanding rice or money. Friars send word that church lands need more workers. Soldiers drag men into polo y servicio, forcing them to abandon their fields for shipyards or roads. You see, frustration etched into calloused hands and tired eyes. Historians still argue whether friar estates developed agriculture or exploited it to ruin. On one hand, the friars introduced new crops, like tobacco and cacao, encouraged irrigation, and managed large tracts of land. On the other, peasants bore the brunt of taxes and rents, sometimes paying in kind until nothing was left for their families. It's the eternal debate. Was this progress, or just dressed-up plunder? You linger at a small fiesta in a rural town. The harvest is in, so people celebrate with music, roasted pig, and dances. You hear the steady beat of bamboo poles and tinkling, dancers hopping gracefully between them like birds escaping traps. Children laugh, old women gossip, and the local priest beams from the sidelines as if the entire event was his idea. But you know better, the joy here isn't colonial. It's human. Night falls, and with it, stories rise. By the fire, elders whisper tales of spirits haunting rice paddies, of giants stomping through mountains, of a swan swooping down to steal livestock or worse. Colonial rule may have reshaped the land, but imagination still belongs to the people. These stories carry resilience, teaching lessons through fear and humor alike. And yet, rebellion brews even here in the quiet countryside. Farmers occasionally refuse to pay tribute, fleeing to mountains rather than bend to friar demands. Some join bands of outlaws, hiding in forests, raiding estates. Others turn their anger inward, blaming neighbors, sparking feuds that last generations. You sense the tension pulsing under the calm. Like a volcano pretending to be a hill, the soundscape of rural life seeps into you. Frogs croaking in rice paddies, the swish of palm fronds, the distant strum of a guitar. It's peaceful, yes, but it's also fragile. Droughts can ruin harvests. Locusts can strip fields bare. Typhoons can flatten villages. And when disaster strikes, tribute collectors rarely show mercy. You shake your head. Nature and empire make a cruel tag team. Still, families endure. You see children carrying bundles of firewood bigger than themselves, laughing as they stumble. You watch mothers weaving mats while fathers mend tools by lamplight. It's not glamorous, but it's the quiet heroism that keeps the colony running while Manila obsesses over silk and silver. You leave the fields with muddy feet and a heart heavy with contradictions. Life here is beautiful in its simplicity, brutal in its burdens, and endlessly resilient. The land itself feels like a silent witness, watching centuries pass while carabaos plod the same furrows and farmers hum the same songs, generation after generation. The rice fields fade behind you, and suddenly the air thickens with salt. The scent of seaweed, dried fish, and brine curls into your nose as you step into coastal towns and harbors, buzzing with energy. Life by the shore is a whole different rhythm. Fishermen shouting over waves, sails snapping in the wind, nets glistening under the sun. You can almost taste the ocean just by breathing. Fishing isn't just work here, it's identity. Before dawn, men push out in slim wooden boats, paddling into dark waters with lanterns flickering like stars scattered across the sea. By sunrise, they return with their catch: bongoos, tilapia, squid wriggling like slimy fireworks. The market erupts into noise as women lay fish on woven trays, their scales flashing like coins. Kids dart through the crowd, sneaking snacks while pretending to help. You smile. It's messy, but it's survival. Here's your mainstream historical fact. During the colonial period, coastal communities supplied not only food for local markets, but also dried fish and seafood for the Manila galleons, feeding sailors on long voyages. Without these small towns, Spain's grand global trade might have starved halfway across the Pacific. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some fishermen believed whistling at sea angered spirits, causing storms or scaring away fish. Break that rule, and you risk getting side-eye from the entire crew. So yes, in a boat full of grown men, total silence often ruled, not because they were stoic, but because no one wanted to jinx dinner. But the coasts aren't just about fish. They're where cultures collide. Chinese traders arrive with porcelain and silk, bringing flavors and recipes that slip into local kitchens. Hello, pancit. Malay and Arab influences linger in ports of Mindanao and Sulu, where sultanates keep up a steady exchange of goods, ideas, and faith. Even as Spain claims the islands, these coastal towns remind you that borders are never as neat as maps suggest. Historians still argue whether these sultanates and trading networks were peripheral to Spain's empire or a parallel system Spain never truly controlled. Watching local rulers negotiate with merchants from Borneo or Makassar, you suspect the latter. Spain had forts and friars, sure, but trade winds often answered to no one. You stroll through a shipyard in Cavite, where the smell of sawdust and tar stings your nose. Shipbuilders hammer planks into place, their rhythm like a heartbeat of industry. Forced labor drags many here, but skills grow nonetheless. Filipino carpenters become experts in shipbuilding, their work sustaining Spain's Pacific lifeline. You run your hand over smooth wood and feel both pride and exhaustion in every grain. Further south, in Zamboanga, you catch sight of a Spanish fort bristling with cannons, standing stubbornly against Muslim raiders known as Moro. For centuries, coastal raids go back and forth. Spanish towns torched by swift sea warriors, retaliatory expeditions striking sultanates. You hear the clash of steel, the boom of cannons, the cries of villagers caught in between. To the colonizers, it's war. To locals, it's survival on contested seas, and yet daily life continues. Women dry seaweed under the sun, turning it into food and medicine. Children chase crabs along the sand, their laughter blending with waves. Fishermen mend nets with fingers quick as birds, humming songs that sound like the ocean itself is singing back. You sense resilience again, this endless ability to live, laugh, and love despite the roar of empires above. Markets in these coastal towns overflow with variety: salt, dried anchovies, woven mats, pearls, coconuts, stacked high like cannonballs. You taste bagoon fermented fish paste, so pungent it nearly knocks you over, but so delicious you immediately want another bite. Local cuisine here is bold, unapologetic, born from abundance and necessity. You also notice religion shaping the shore. In Catholic-dominated regions, processions carry statues of saints along the sand. Fishermen dipping nets in holy water before casting out to sea. In Muslim sultanates, calls to prayer echo over harbors, blending with goal cries. The contrast is sharp, but also strangely harmonious. Different faiths, carried by the same tides. Night on the coast glimmers differently than in the countryside. Lanterns bob on boats like fireflies, bonfires crackle on beaches, and guitars strum love songs that travel across the water. Lovers sneak onto sand dunes, whispering under starlight, while old men tell tales of mermaids luring fishermen or sea monsters lurking beyond the reefs. You lean in closer, goosebumps rising, not because you believe, but because the ocean makes everything possible. Standing there, waves licking at your feet. You realize the sea is more than background. It's the artery that keeps this archipelago alive. It connects islands, cultures, faiths, and markets. It delivers wealth and danger, hope and loss. Spain might build walls in Manila, but here on the coasts, the horizon is endless, untamed, and stubbornly free. The salty winds of the coast fade, and you find yourself once again stepping into the heart of the colony, Manila. But not just any Manila, the fortified city of Intramuros. Its stone walls loom tall, casting shadows that feel heavy with authority. You pass through a massive gate guarded by soldiers in stiff uniforms, their pikes glinting in the sunlight. And suddenly you're inside Spain's prized jewel in Asia. Intramuros isn't large, but it feels like another world. Streets are cobbled and neatly laid out, houses built of stone and wood with red-tiled roofs. Churches dominate the skyline, their bells echoing across the Pasig River. Horses clatter over the stones, pulling carriages. And you sidestep so you don't end up with a hoofprint souvenir. Everything here smells faintly of candle wax, roasted cacao, and horse manure, colonial cocktail that no one asked for. Here's your mainstream. Historical fact: Intramuros was established in 1571 after the conquest of Manila, serving as the political, religious, and economic center of Spanish rule in the Philippines. It housed government offices, universities, convents, and the residences of Spanish officials and clergy. For over 3 centuries, this walled enclave was Spain's fortress of power. Now for the quirky tidbit. Rules inside Intramuros were strict. Filipinos and Chinese were generally barred from living inside the walls, relegated instead to districts outside like Binondo or the Parian. Yet ironically, those outsider districts became the real engines of commerce. It's like throwing the party in your living room, but all the fun happening next door. Life. Inside the walls is both grand and stifling. Spanish officials sip chocolate drinks served thick and rich, gossip about politics, and complain about the tropical heat while waving fans dramatically. Friars in flowing robes march down streets with the authority of kings. Students in the University of Santo Tomas argue about Latin declensions they'll probably never use again. You catch glimpses of women in lace veils, peeking from balconies, curious but guarded. But it's not all solemnity. You hear the laughter of children in courtyards, smell pastries baking in convent kitchens, and even stumble into a musical performance where guitars and violins weave European melodies with local flair. Intramuros may be rigid in its rules, but life still sneaks in through cracks. Outside the walls, though, a different Manila thrives. In Binondo, Chinese merchants run shops brimming with silk, porcelain, and spices. In Tondo, Filipino workers load and unload goods, their sweat greasing the wheels of empire. The contrast is sharp. Inside, wealth and order. Outside, hustle and grit. Yet the two worlds depend on each other like reluctant dance partners. Historians still argue whether Intramuros symbolized Spain's strength or its insecurity. Was it a proud fortress projecting power, or a cage built because colonizers feared the very people they ruled? Walking its echoing corridors, since both a city meant to impress, but also to isolate, you slip into the shadow of San Agustin Church, its thick stone walls cool even in the midday sun. Inside, chandeliers sparkle above marble floors, and paintings of saints gaze down with eyes that seem a little too judgmental. You sit quietly, listening to the murmurs of prayer, and you wonder, did locals feel awe here or alienation? Maybe both, depending on the heart that entered. Beyond the solemnity, you find entertainment too. Intramuros boasted theaters where plays were staged, some satirizing colonial life, others pious enough to make friars smile. Cockfights happen just outside the gates, drawing crowds from every class. And in times of fiesta, the walls themselves seem to vibrate with music, parades, and fireworks that lit up the sky. You chuckle, nothing says empire like fireworks funded by tribute taxes, yet danger always lurks. Earthquakes periodically rattle the city, knocking down churches and houses. Fires sweep through wooden upper floors, leaving only stone shells. Typhoons batter the walls, flooding streets until carriages turn into makeshift boats. Each disaster feels like the land itself reminding Spain, these islands are not yours. No matter how many stones you pile up, as dusk falls, torches flicker along the walls, soldiers pacing with muskets at their sides. You climb up the ramparts, the Pasig River glimmering below, and gaze out. Beyond the walls lie countless lives, countless struggles, countless voices Spain can never fully silence. Inside, the air feels ordered but claustrophobic. Outside, chaotic but alive. You breathe deep, knowing that walls may guard power for a time, but they can never hold history forever. The stone walls of Intramuros fade into the background as you drift into the barrios, the neighborhoods where most of life really happens. Here, houses rise on stilts made of bamboo and nipa, their thatched roofs swaying like giant hats in the breeze. You step onto a bamboo floor that creaks under your weight, and the whole house seems to breathe with you. Beneath, chickens scratch in the dirt, pigs grunt lazily, and children dart in and out, shouting games that sound both chaotic and musical. Life here is simple but far from easy. The Bahay Kubo, that iconic nipa hut, is practical genius. It breathes in the heat, survives floods by standing tall on stilts, and if a storm knocks it down, no problem. People just rebuild with bamboo, palm leaves, and sweat. A family might spend days weaving walls, singing while they work, making labor feel lighter. You can't help but smile. Modern architects would call it sustainable design. But here it's just survival dressed in simplicity. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Most Filipinos during Spanish rule lived in small rural communities with Bahay Kubo as their main dwellings. These homes reflected not only the resourcefulness of the people, but also the environmental realities of a tropical archipelago. They were affordable, practical, and perfectly adapted to climate and terrain. And the quirky tidbit? Some people decorated their huts with chili peppers, strung like garlands. Why not just for cooking? Locals believed it warded off witches and bad spirits. Forget fancy security systems. In the barrio, a spicy door charm was the ultimate home protection plan. Daily life runs on routines shaped by land and weather. At dawn, roosters crow, women sweep yards with palm brooms, and men head to the fields or rivers. At noon, hammocks sway lazily as heat presses down, and by evening, smoke rises from clay stoves cooking rice, fish, and vegetables fresh from backyard gardens. Nights are alive with cicadas and laughter, neighbors gathering to share stories, play music, or simply chew betel nut until their teeth glow red. But the barrios aren't isolated bubbles. Tribute collectors arrive with heavy demands, often escorted by soldiers. Friars pass through to bless, baptize, or scold. Bandits sometimes raid, especially in remote areas, stealing food or livestock. You see the unease in villagers' eyes. They want peace. But they know power rarely leaves them alone. Still, joy refuses to die. Children chase fireflies, mothers sing lullabies that float into the night, and fathers carve toys out of wood scraps. Festivals transform quiet barrios into bursts of color, with dances, games, and processions. Music is everywhere. Bamboo flutes, drums, and improvised instruments, turning every gathering into a small concert. Historians still argue about how Christianized these communities truly became. Were the villagers deeply converted, or did they simply blend Catholic rituals with their old animist beliefs? Watching a fiesta, you notice villagers carrying a saint statue, but also whispering prayers to rice spirits before planting. It's less contradiction, more fusion, a faith both borrowed and made their own. You notice too how barter thrives here. A family with extra rice trades for fish. A skilled weaver swaps mats for coconuts. Money exists, sure, but trust and community often matter more. It's a system Spain could never fully regulate. Maybe that's why it survived beneath the empire's nose. Then there's Gossipo, the gossip. In every barrio, news spreads faster than typhoon winds. Who owes tribute? Who snuck out to meet a lover? Who saw strange lights by the river at midnight? Sometimes gossip is entertainment. Sometimes it's a weapon sharper than any blade. You Chuckalits, basically the social media of the 1600s. Night falls. Oil lamps glow in huts, casting warm light through woven walls. Families gather on bamboo floors, eating together from shared dishes. You sit cross-legged, the air filled with the scent of garlic rice and dried fish. A child shyly offers you a piece of roasted sweet potato, her smile wide and proud. And for a moment, empire, tribute, and oppression feel far away. But then you remember these barrios are also seeds of resistance. Hidden in their simplicity is strength. From these, Nepa huts will rise farmers who take up bolos against unfair taxes, workers who flee to mountains to join rebels, poets who turn songs into protest. The empire may have its walls and cannons, but here in the quiet villages, history quietly gathers courage. From the nipa huts of the barrio, your journey carries you into spaces where ideas simmer hotter than rice in a clay pot. The schools, the convents, and the world of knowledge under colonial rule. At first, you expect dusty classrooms and strict teachers, but what you find is a landscape of contradictions, where learning can both liberate and control. Education in Spanish Philippines is mostly in the hands of friars. They run schools attached to churches, teaching, reading, writing, and above all, Catholic doctrine. Lessons are often in Spanish or Latin, though most students barely understand those languages. Still, children memorize prayers, chant catechisms, and copy letters on wax tablets until their hands ache. It's not exactly Hogwarts, but for many, it's the only path toward literacy. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Spain established the first European-style schools and universities in Asia, right here in the Philippines. The University of Santo Tomas, founded in 1611, is older than Harvard. That's right, Filipinos were debating philosophy and theology in classrooms, while the American colonies were still chopping down forests. Now for the quirky tidbit. Friars sometimes used singing to teach prayers. Picture a class of sleepy kids forced to chant the Ave Maria in a tune suspiciously close to a folk lullaby. It was catchy, but also risky. Students would later mix sacred lyrics with cheeky verses about food, neighbors, or even the friars themselves. Call it the first case of academic parody, but education was far from equal. Elite families, especially mestizos and those favored by friars, gained access to higher learning. They learned Spanish, read European books, and sometimes even studied abroad. Meanwhile, most ordinary Filipinos learned just enough to recite prayers and follow orders. Knowledge was rationed like sugar, sweet but carefully measured. Historians still argue whether this system enlightened or exploited. On one hand, it spread literacy and opened doors to global ideas. On the other, it reinforced obedience, with friars ensuring loyalty to crown and church came before critical thinking. You look at a classroom and wonder, were these children being prepared for the future or just trained to kneel better? Beyond the schools, convents loom as centers of power. Inside thick walls, friars kept not only books and relics but also archives filled with reports, censuses, and letters. These were the bureaucratic engines of empire. Scribes bending over desks by candlelight, documenting lives they barely understood. Imagine hundreds of names written in ink, whole villages reduced to lists on paper neat by. But cold, yet knowledge can never be fully caged. In marketplaces and along rivers, oral traditions flourish. Storytellers spin tales of heroes and tricksters, passing wisdom through laughter. Herbalists share cures not found in friar books. Farmers teach their children how to read the sky for storms, a skill more practical than any Latin grammar. You realize the Philippines had its own libraries, ones carried in memory, in song, in practice. Then there are the women. While friars dominate formal education, many mothers teach children at home, passing down values, prayers, and practical knowledge. Midwives, healers, and weavers hold expertise that no Spanish school ever recognized. In their hands, culture and survival intertwine, resilient against official neglect. Even in higher learning, sparks of independence flicker. Students exposed to philosophy and history begin to ask uncomfortable questions. Why are liberty and justice praised in theory but denied in practice? Why do friars teach love for all while hoarding land? These questions, whispered in dormitories and written in secret notebooks, become seeds for future revolutions. You step into a classroom lit by oil lamps. A friar lectures sternly on obedience while a student doodles in the margins of his notebook a small sketch of a bolo raised against a friar. You grin. History isn't just memorized. It's imagined in rebellion. As night settles, you find yourself outside a convent library. Inside, rows of books line wooden shelves. Theology, philosophy, science, all locked away from most locals. The friar librarian snores at his desk, while somewhere in the barrio, a grandmother tells a folktale that makes children's eyes widen. Two worlds of knowledge exist side by side, one shared freely, and you know which one truly keeps the people alive? From the quiet hush of convent libraries, you now wander into the loud, colorful chaos of the marketplace, the true beating heart of everyday colonial life. Forget the walls of Intramuros or the solemn sermons of friars. Here in the Tianjie, life is noisy, smelly, and wonderfully alive. You hear it before you see it. Vendors shouting prices, roosters crowing, pots clanging, children laughing. Then the smells hit you: dried fish sharp enough to sting your nose, grilled meats dripping fat onto hot coals, baskets of fresh mangoes so sweet they perfume the air. It's overwhelming, but in the best way. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Markets were crucial to the colonial economy. They connected rural producers with urban consumers, allowed Chinese and Filipino traders to interact, and fed the colony's obsession with silver, silk, and spices. Even the mighty Galleon trade relied on these local markets for everyday goods. And the quirky tidbit: some vendors trained parrots to shout advertisements. Imagine walking past a stall and hearing Billy, nah, meringue mura. Not from the vendor, but from a feathered bird perched on a bamboo stick. Free labor and entertainment rolled into one. The stalls are small, but packed with variety. Baskets of rice stand beside jars of vinegar and salt. Woven mats, clay pots, and wooden spoons gleam in the sun. Spices from India mix with Chinese porcelain, Mexican chocolate, and local coconuts. You realize this isn't just a market, it's a global trade hub shrunk down into bamboo stalls and woven baskets. But money isn't always the main currency. Barter thrives here, just like in the barrios. A farmer trades bananas for fish. A potter swaps jars for rice. Deals are struck with handshakes, smiles, and sometimes heated arguments. Coins jingle in some pockets. But trust and reputation often matter more than silver. Historians still argue whether colonial markets empowered locals or exploited them. On one hand, Filipinos gained access to global goods and built thriving commercial communities, especially the Chinese in Binondo. On the other, taxes, monopolies, and tribute often sucked profits upward. Leaving peasants with little more than survival, you duck into a corner where storytellers draw crowds, narrating tales of heroes, lovers, or tricksters. A man balances on a crate, dramatically acting out a battle between a Spanish soldier and a tikbalang. Laughter ripples through the audience. Markets weren't just about goods. They were stages for performance, gossip, and imagination. Nearby, gamblers crowd around cockfights, the air thick with shouts and wagers. Chickens clash in bursts of feathers, men cheering or cursing depending on the outcome. Friars officially disapprove, but you suspect some sneak in when no one's watching. It's part economy, part entertainment, part raw adrenaline. You watch women negotiate prices with the fierceness of generals. Their baskets swing from their arms loaded with produce. Children tug at skirts, begging for sweets or toys. Old men chew betel nut, their mouths red as if stained with blood, spitting casually onto the dirt. The marketplace doesn't care about status. Everyone has to haggle. Then the undercurrents hit you. Soldiers stroll through, demanding taxes or bribes. Tribute collectors eye stalls like vultures. Rumors spread quickly. A band of rebels in the mountains. A shortage of rice. A storm that may ruin next week's supply. Fear lingers beneath the laughter, reminding everyone that markets may be free in spirit, but not free in law, as dusk falls. Oil lamps flicker on, casting a golden glow on stalls. Vendors pack up, children run off with sticky fingers from stolen sweets, and musicians strike up songs to end the day. You buy a roasted plantain, its caramelized skin cracking under your teeth, sit at the edge of the market. It's messy, crowded, and loud, but it feels more real than any stone, palace, or church. Here, you sense the pulse of the colony, a place where cultures mix, where survival meets creativity, where oppression never fully erases joy. The marketplace is the people's kingdom, noisy and defiant, and you can't help but love it. The chatter of the market fades, and now you find yourself drifting toward the quiet twilight of the Spanish era when the old empire's grip begins to weaken. You walk through streets that once echoed with the clatter of galleons and the booming voices of friars. But now you hear whispers of discontent, of change, of a new dawn struggling to break through. Spain is still here. Of course, its flags fluttering over forts, its friars striding across plazas. But the cracks are visible. Rebellions flare in the countryside, like stubborn fires refusing to be snuffed out. The Katipunan swells in secret, sharpening bolos and chanting oaths in the night. You can almost hear the rustle of paper as young men pass around pamphlets, poems, and novels that burn hotter than any torch. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the late 19th century, the Philippines was restless. The propaganda movement, led by figures like José Rizal, Marcelo del Pilar, and Graciano López Llena, challenged Spain through words, while the Katipunan, led by Andres Bonifacio, prepared for armed revolution. These twin currents, intellect and insurgency, pushed the islands toward inevitable change. And the quirky tidbit, rebels often use coded messages hidden in ordinary items. A folded fan, a string of laundry, even a handkerchief tied a certain way, could signal meeting times or warn of danger. Imagine hanging your laundry and accidentally calling a rebellion meeting. Awkward, but revolutionary. Historians still argue whether Spain's fall was inevitable or sped up by circumstance. Was it the sheer determination of Filipinos? Or the crumbling of Spain's global empire after losses in Cuba and Puerto Rico? Either way, you feel the tide shifting. Spain is tired, the people are ready, and history is about to turn the page. But this isn't the end. Across the ocean, a new player waits America, with promises of liberty, but ambitions of its own. You see the shadows lengthen, the sound of cannons in Manila Bay already rumbling faintly in the distance. One colonizer may be leaving, but another is preparing to arrive. And here you sit. Between two eras, watching a nation in transition, the nipa huts, the stone walls, the bustling markets, the whispered prayers. The shouted oatsal of it swirls together, creating the identity of a people who refuse to be erased. The Philippines stands battered but unbroken, scarred but still dreaming, waiting for the dawn of true independence. You breathe deeply. The air smells of smoke, sweat, and salt water like history itself. You know the story isn't over, but for tonight, you've traced its path, from ancient barangays to galleons, from friars to rebels, from Spain's iron grip to the threshold of America's embrace. And though independence hasn't yet arrived, you feel it like the hush before sunrise. Inevitable, unstoppable. Now your eyelids grow heavy, and the story softens. Let's wind down together. The noise of markets, the clash of bolos, the thunder of galleons, all of it begins to fade into the background. The colors soften, as if painted in watercolors instead of carved in stone. You imagine the nipa huts swaying gently in the breeze, their bamboo walls glowing with lamplight. Families settle into sleep, their laughter lingering faintly in the night air. Somewhere, a grandmother hums a lullaby. Her voice is steady as the stars overhead. You picture the waves rolling onto the shores of Luzon and Visayas and Mindanao. Steady and eternal, just as they were before colonizers arrived, and just as they will be long after empires vanish. The islands breathe with Yucam, patient, resilient. The rivers murmur softly. The mountains stand watch like guardians. And the night sky spreads wide and comforting. Your body relaxes as you drift further, carried by the slow rhythm of history itself. Every rebellion, every triumph, every heartbreak becomes part of a larger story, a story of endurance, of hope, of becoming. The Philippines before independence was never silent, never still. It pulsed with life, resistance, and dreams, and those dreams are what carry you gently now into rest. So close your eyes. Let the waves of history wash over you like a lullaby. The journey has been long, but here, at the edge of sleep, you can let go. Tomorrow the story continues, but for tonight, peace is enough. Good night, traveler. Sweet dreams.